Hey everybody, Little Drummer Boy here, and today I'm going to do a book review on our founding father and second president, and father of the sixth president, John Quincy Adams, John Adams. And this book is by David McCullough. It was a bestseller and, of course, world renowned. And it's a long book, over 650 pages. But man, it's an awesome read about founding father John Adams, who was born in Braintree, Massachusetts in 1735. And it was said that Thomas Jefferson, our second president, he of course wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was said that he was the pen of independence and John Adams was the mouth of independence. He's the one that pushed for the Declaration of Independence from England in Congress, and he is the one in Congress who pushed for the Constitution. Although James Madison was the father of the Constitution, it was John Adams that pushed it through. He had an extraordinary life. Let's look at and he lived to be 90 years old, which was a long time, especially in those days. Let's look at the contents first, like I always like to do. The road to Philadelphia, it starts out when he was called to the Continental Congress. Of course, the capital at that time was Philadelphia. Washington, D.C. wasn't built until 1800, the year after President Washington died. The road to Philadelphia, True Blue, Colossus of Independence, appointment to France. He was our first ambassador to France. Unalterably Determined, Abigail in Paris. Abigail was his wife, and she's brilliant too. This book has a lot of in-depth detail about his family life, including letters back and forth between him and Abigail and his children, and they were all brilliant. John Adams was the first president with a college education and was educated at Harvard, which back at that time was actually a good conservative college name for a pastor. It's still named for a pastor, but boy, has it strayed. Anyway, London, heir apparent. In other words, he was the heir apparent to Washington because John Adams was the first vice president of the United States under Washington, who was the first president. Old Oak, statesman, rejoice evermore, journey's end. And it's a long read. It took me, I read a little bit in it every night. It wasn't like it was a marathon read or anything. But I started on July 4th. I thought, what a, great patriotic day to read about John Adams. And I have a goal of reading a book on each president, except Obama. I don't consider him a president because I don't believe he was born in America. I believe he is a usurper and an apostate. So anyway, let's get into it. Let's look at some of the pictures because, like the Rod Stewart song says, a picture tells a story, don't it? Or a picture tells a story, don't it? Anyway, here's the main culprit of the revolution. This is King George III. He, was putting a lot of taxes on our ancestors here, and I'm in North Carolina, by the way, one of the original colonies, and my ancestors were here then. Anyway, King George, and one of them, Peter Little, fought in the Revolution, but King George put a lot of taxes on our ancestors here in the colonies, and they let, soldiers were allowed to quarter in your house. You didn't really have a choice. But what really started the revolution was when British troops fired on American protesters in Boston wanting freedom. And actually, the first person killed was a young black man. It was the first person to die for America. And this is John Adams' well-worn schoolboy copy of Cicero, which he signed several times and dated 1750. Here's Harvard, his alma mater, America's first college, and an engraving by Paul Revere, "Give me liberty or give me death, Paul Revere." To Adams, his years at Harvard were total and complete happiness. And these guys are hard to read, man. Let me tell you, when you read Washington, Adams, Jefferson, they speak in the Old English, and no doubt they had a heavy English accent. But their paragraphs were like half a page long. Their sentences were half a page long. But it's still worth reading it. And they wrote very fanciful too. Everything they said had to be said in like a fancy, aristocratic fashion. But you can still get their drift. This is the Weymouth Parsonage, where Abigail Smith was born, and she and John Adams were married October 25th, 1764. And this is the Boston Massacre. This is what led up to the Revolution. And funny thing is, even though John Adams was a patriot, and, you know, one of the most important people, him, Jefferson, Washington, and Madison are the most important founders in our nation's history. But as a lawyer, when the Boston Massacre happened in 1770, he actually defended the British troops. He's a lawyer, so, you know, lawyers will defend anybody. Here is a map of of Boston. I've been there once. I drove through Boston trucking, drove right by the Green Monster, and went under Boston Harbor. It was hard to imagine what it was like back then because the skyscrapers, and, you know, you take a tunnel under the harbor, and there were even exits in that tunnel, which I'd never seen in any tunnel before. A 1775 map of Boston and vicinity shows troop placement toward the end of the first year of the Revolution. Braintree and Weymouth are at Lower Center. And this is the handwriting of John Adams. John Adams was probably en route to the Continental Congress in early 1776 when he listed a small notebook that needed all that needed to be accomplished, including at bottom a Declaration of Independence. And then this is a painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I've been there in Independence Hall, been in the very room where it happened in Philadelphia, and it's a lot smaller than I thought. The Independence Hall is about the same size as my church, and my church isn't a big church. Young John Quincy Adams, who sailed twice for Europe with his father in the midst of war, and they went through some big-time storms getting there, too. Drawings from John Quincy's journal. On the first voyage at age 10, he learned the names of every sail. A list of personal supplies to be taken on the eventful voyage of the 24-gun frigate Boston to France in winter of 1778. And you got 1 bushel of Indian meal, 1 case of rum, some kind of paper, 2 account books, 1/4 quills, 30 something of brown sugar, box of wafers, bottle of port, wine. John Adams, of course, he wasn't a drunk, but he liked to drink. He liked to drink hard apple cider. And but sadly, his son, Charles Adams, died of alcoholism. That's something he and President Trump have in common for sure, is his son died of alcoholism while he was president, and President Trump's older brother, Fred, died of alcoholism. And President Trump's brother, Robert, rest in peace, just died recently while Trump was president. Pipes, tobacco, bottle of mustard, 2 bottles of mustard, tea, chocolate, something else. Can't read the rest of it. The adoration of Benjamin Franklin in Paris was of utmost value to the American cause, as Adams recognized. But to his surprise, Adams found Franklin to be lazy, neglectful of details, and not so easy to work with. So here's Adams in Paris. And, of course, he had a love-hate relationship with President Thomas Jefferson, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Back then, whoever lost the presidential election became the vice president. Now, could you imagine Hillary being Trump's vice president? Oh, my gosh, she would have already had him Epstein off by now. But so yeah, so Jefferson became that's my lady dog over there. Jefferson became the vice president for Adams, and then went on to beat Adams in the 1800 election. So they differed a lot on things, on politics, but Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, and Adams, who didn't like George Washington, he didn't want political parties, but he got lumped in with the Federalists. And so they were different on politics a lot of the times, but they remained lifelong friends. And ironically, President John Quincy Adams, who was president at the time, and the whole nation saw this as God's divine providence and stamp of approval on America. This is a God thing. It can't be coincidence. President John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on America's 50th birthday, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826. They both died that day. And actually, the funny thing is Jefferson died first, but Adams didn't know that. President John Quincy Adams didn't even know his father died till after he was buried, because news traveled slow back then. They didn't have telegraph yet. But so Adams, thinking that Jefferson was still living, said Jefferson survives. Those were his last words, not knowing that Jefferson had died that morning. This is a foreign minister. This is Adams' French dictionary. This is a hotel in The Hague where Adams stayed when he was ambassador to Holland. More of The Hague. Here's an unfinished painting by Benjamin West. John Jay standing left. He was the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. Adams, Franklin, Henry Lawrence, William Templeton Franklin, the secretary, gathered for the signing of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War in 1783. It actually ended 2 years before at the Battle of Yorktown, when Lord Cornwallis surrendered to Washington, but it wasn't done up on paper until in Paris 2 years later. And here is where John Adams signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolution. This is a home in France where the Adamses lived. A letter to his sister. The Paris Opera, which Abigail really enjoyed. And here is a good painting of John Adams. And he actually appeared before King George III as the first ambassador to England for America. Here's the house where he was born. It's still there. You can see it. John Adams was born in 1735 in the Braintree farmhouse on the right. He and Abigail made their first home in the nearly identical house on the left. Both houses still stand. And here's Abigail. She was a pretty lady. And John Adams. And one thing I love about this book, and I quoted a ton of it on Facebook, man, they had a strong faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, and they weren't bashful to quote scripture or to talk. You know, you hear about separation of church and state, which was actually just in a letter from Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Convention in 1800, promising them the church would stay out of the church, the state would stay out of the church's business. But our founding fathers were strong Christians, and John Adams in particular. Here's a painting of him. And here is his good friend, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the third president. Here's John Quincy Adams future President John Quincy Adams at age 29. Unlike his brother Charles, who died an alcoholic, John Quincy Adams, he graduated from Harvard, and he's kind of like my older brother. He excelled at everything he did, and eventually became president. He was president when his father died. Charles Adams, the second the second and most gentleman at 27, artist unknown. Okay, this is Charles. This is the one who sadly succumbed to alcohol in 1800, and he died just before his father, John Adams, knew that he had been, just before he found out that he had been defeated by Jefferson in the 1800 election. Thomas Boylston Adams, a third son, and a spice of fun in his composition at 23. Nabby Adams, this is their daughter, and he lost her too young too. He lost her to breast cancer when she was 46, but she was the delight of her mother and father. Nabby Adams at 19 by Mather Brown. To her father, the portrait called both her drollery and modesty. I'm not sure what drollery means. Some of these words, back 200 years ago, we don't use anymore. Here's Abigail in 1800 when she became the second First Lady and the first Lady to live in the Executive Mansion, which would later be called, by McKinley some 90 years later, would be called the White House. There's another portrait by Adams in 1798 when he was president, And here he was 89, year before his death, in this picture. And I think that's, here's some more, never mind. There's George Washington, the father of our country, in 1790 when he was president. Here is George Washington taking the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City, which was the capital at that time. They chose the Virginia-Maryland border for the federal city of Washington because they wanted, one thing, four of our first presidents were from Virginia, but they wanted the capital to be centrally located, and so the country went from Georgia to Vermont, New Hampshire about that time, so Washington, D.C. was centrally located. Vice President John Adams, and here is when he lived. This is where he lived on the Hudson River in New York when he was vice president. Never did I live in so delightful a spot. John Adams rode to Richmond Hill, and Adams's rented house overlooking the Hudson River. He really liked the view of the Hudson from there. And if you've been to New York, from the high bluffs, or New Jersey, from the high bluffs, there are beautiful views of New York City, and it's raining. New York City and the Hudson River. Unlike Washington and Adams, Secretary of State Jefferson gloried in the French Revolution. And this is Citizen Jeanette, a French friend of Adams's. And this is terrible, man. During the French Revolution, it was really bloody and violent. It was inspired by the American Revolution. But you think we're having mobs and stuff now, which is bad as it is. But this is the execution by guillotine of King Louis the 16th in Paris, January 21st, 1793. Not only did they chop off his head, but they chopped off his wife's head. Dadgummit, what was her name? Adams was among the very few who foresaw the coming bloodbath of terror. Marie Antoinette, that was her name. They executed the Queen too. Crazy. Now, there are some people, past leaders in our country, that deserve execution for treason, but they actually, did something wrong. Okay, here's the president's house in Philadelphia in 1797. This was the first president's house. This is where George Washington lived when he was president in Philly. Here's another portrait of Adams. Benjamin Rush, who was a great friend of his and his doctor, he got a bad rap because he would bleed people to get their bad blood out, which, now doctors know is insane. Political independent Elbridge Gerry. He was the vice president under Jefferson. High Federalist Timothy Pickering from Charleston, South Carolina, beautiful Charleston, who as Secretary of State opposed or secretly undercut Adams at almost every chance. Thank God he never got elected president because he ran. Alexander Hamilton. Now, he was a wild one. You know that famous play, Hamilton's all about him. Alexander Hamilton in New York. He was our first Treasury Secretary, which is why he is on the $10 bill. New York, in a portrait by John Trumbull. As Washington's brilliant Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton had at first greatly impressed Adams, but later betrayed him. To Abigail Adams, Hamilton was a dangerous man, another Bonaparte. Chief Justice John Marshall, the first Chief Marshal of the U.S. Supreme Court. A letter to Abigail from the President's house. And he wrote this, and then it was inscribed into the mantle of the White House, and it's still there today because Adams was the first president to live in the White House. I pray heaven to bestow the best blessings on this house and all that shall heretofore inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. Well, God answered his prayer for the most part, but there have been, there was Harding and LBJ and Clinton and Obama, so there's been some real scoundrels that lived up in there, but for the most part, I think we've had godly and honest, wise men for presidents. Jefferson's plan for a pavilion at the new University of Virginia. When Jefferson retired, he started the University of Virginia, and my cousin Rebecca Little is a student there now up in Charlottesville. Here's Jefferson at 78, at Monticello in 1821. The Adams house in Quincy, where John and Abigail spent their last years of their lives, remained the family homestead for 3 more generations. John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, in a portrait by Gilbert Stuart in 1825 and finished by Thomas Sully in 1830. And I'm not really sure, I don't know a lot about the John Quincy presidency, but I know him and his father both only served 1 term. John Quincy Adams was defeated by South Carolina native General Andrew Jackson. And here is a bust of John Adams. So yeah, it's a great read, y'all. I give it 5 stars. You won't get bored with it, but it's a long book. It's not an easy read. And one thing, like I said, reading the guys, these brilliant men from 200 years ago, isn't easy because of the way they wrote and spoke. But it's worth it. It's a great read. Not a boring page in it out of the 656 pages. Peace out, y'all. I'll see you in the next video. Oh, and if you like my content, please share, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you can be notified when I upload a new video. Thank you and have a blessed day.